Hello and welcome back. So if you've been watching this channel, you know that the fastest way to perform better in fantasy is to look for value wherever you can find it. In my most recent series, we looked at overdraft candidates and buy low targets to try to sort through the numbers and find out where the value lies. But one thing I want everyone to take away from this channel is the mindset of searching for value. Some of my subscribers have asked me to do a player rankings, and I definitely would enjoy doing that. But one thing that I wanted to, kind of give as the biggest takeaway from my content is that it's more important to have a strategy and to look for value plays that work within that strategy than to just look at a list of 22, 23 targets and blindly pick from that list. And as a part of that thought process, today I wanted to explore the idea of the contract year bump as it relates to fantasy hockey. Is there value to be had in looking at contract status? That's one of the questions that we're trying to answer today. But the main question overall is, do players perform better or worse when they're in a contract year, when they're playing for a contract? The theory and the logic behind this concept suggests that players are more highly motivated to earn the bulk of their money for their entire career in a contract year, so they perform well in that year when they're about to hit free agency. Does this actually play out when we look at the data? That was the question that I've had this in the back of my mind for quite a while, and I kind of took a while to do this analysis because I've been working on other things. But the way we're going to look at the data for the contract year bump, I analyzed both 5-year average data as well as previous season data, and we looked at what the player did in the year when they were playing for a contract, when they were about to be a free agent at the end of the season, and compared that to their 5-year average. So we'll look at how the data panned out as well as the potential targets for this year, because if you're looking at this, there needs to be some sort of value that you can apply to your team this year as well. So let's just look at the 2022 free agents. Was there a contract year bump? So for the 2022 free agent class, I looked at all available fantasy relevant players to get a general sense of the entire group. So as fantasy relevant, I basically cut it off with Colin Blackwell, as once we got to that point, a lot of guys were not fantasy relevant. So there were 42 total players I looked at. 19 of those 42 overperformed their 5-year average. 23 underperformed. So right off the bat, it looks like the contract year bump is not necessarily all it's cracked up to be. But what was interesting was the fact that the amount by which the overperformers exceeded their average was more than double the amount that the underperformers underperformed their averages. In other words, the players who overperformed did so more significantly than the underperformers. So for example, there were a lot of guys that underperformed by 0.001 or 0.003, which isn't statistically significant, whereas the overperformers did so more significantly. And that number, that 0.001, 0.003, that's the difference between the point per game average they put up last season and their 5-year average. So you take last year's number, you subtract it from the 5-year average, and that's the number. So if it was between 0.001 and 0.005, there wasn't really much of a difference there. On top of all of that, 7 of the top 10 earners in free agency by contract value, their 5-year they overperformed their 5-year averages, as you can see from this spreadsheet example below. You'll notice in this year, the top 2 free agents significantly overperformed their 5-year averages, which is pretty obvious to anyone who watched Kadri and Goudreau play. Palat basically hit his 5-year average almost on the dot, but the 2 players that underperformed are both candidates for bounce back years. So if you look at Trocheck, he's now going to get exposure to Panarin. So that's going to instantly bump his value in the offseason. If he's still sliding your draft, that could be a decent bounce back play, considering the fact that he's going to factor into the Rangers' top 6, and he might get a chance on that first power play unit as well. And if you look at his 5-year average of 0.73 is nothing to shake your head at. The 0.62 underperformance is not crazy, and now he's likely to be put on the same line as one of the best offensive producers in the game, so that could be some value right there. And then if you look at Claude Giroux, last year going to a new team for the first time in his career. So it's been, I think, something along the lines of 14 years that he's been a part of the Flyers organization, because I believe he was drafted in 2008. And so he's been there his whole life. He finally uprooted himself and went to Florida, had to readjust. So maybe that's where that underperformance comes into play. But he still had a 0.86 point per game average last year. So that's a little bit under his 0.94 5-year average, but it's still really good. And then on top of that, he's going to a stacked Ottawa team, in at least the top 6. So he's either going to be playing with DeBrincat and Stützle or Tkachuk and Batherson. So both of those winger options are incredibly bullish for Claude Giroux. But one of the things that we want to take away from the contract year bump part of this is that 7 of these 10 guys overperformed and then they got paid. So that's one of the confirming statistics that does sort of prove that there is such a thing as a contract year bump. But let's take a look at 2021. So for the 2021 free agent class, I just looked at the top 10 earners, and I did that for 2 reasons. Because A, I would have had to calculate new 5-year averages for 30 additional players without much improvement to the overall analysis, mainly because B, the theory is that players signed large contracts are less incentivized. So if a guy, if a borderline NHL player finally gets a one-way contract, sure, they may be appropriately incentivized, but that doesn't necessarily help us in fantasy, as they're not likely to be fantasy relevant. The most relevance to your fantasy team will be found at the top of these free agent lists, as they're more likely to be drafted. So even with that, some of the top 10 free agents weren't necessarily fantasy ownable, as we'll see. In this set, 4 players overperformed, 5 players underperformed, and 1 hit their average right on the nose. That was Jake McCabe. Just like with the previous year, the overperformers more than doubled the amount that they exceeded their 5-year averages compared to the underperformers. So another interesting note, as we look at, so you can see there, the 0.13, that was the number that the overperformers exceeded their 5-year average. 0.06 was the underperformers underperforming their 5-year average. Now, with that said, another interesting note, as we look to the spreadsheet at the bottom here, the 4 players on the bottom all underperformed, while 4 of the top 6 overperformed. So this could mean 2 things. Either there's a correlation between better play and becoming a free agent, or that the guys who overperformed and put up great stats the season that they were about to become a free agent were overpaid because of that, and therefore are at the top of the free agent list when ranked by total contract amount, which is how these lists were formed. So I picked off the Sport Track data set, so it was essentially ranked by the total amount of the contract signed. So if a guy signed an 8 times 8, it was $68 million, and that put him towards the top of the list. So what this could tell you is that the guys at the top are getting paid that way because they overperformed. But at the same time, the guys at the bottom of this list, they all underperformed, and some of them not by any marginal. 0.01, that's even, and then 0.02. The one exception is Mikael Granlund. Now, Granlund had a higher 5-year point per game average than Zach Hyman or Philip Deneau or Blake Coleman, but he underperformed during his contract year and was therefore paid less than those 3. Now, for Deneau, who was the main underperformer in the top 6 of this list, he mainly made his money off the playoff performance that he put up. So he got his money on the back of that defensive masterclass in the playoffs, shutting down Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vegas en route to the finals. So that probably factors into why he was paid like that. And he has been good value. His offensive production actually took a bump from this number last season. But what you want to take away from this is still a lot of the guys at the top are overperforming. The guys at the bottom of this list are underperforming or staying right where they are. That could explain why they're being paid like that. So let's take a look at the 2020 free agent lists. The 2020 class was very unique and interesting. There was an even split between over and under producers, with the top 5 free agent earners overproducing and the bottom 5 underproducing. So we look at the spreadsheet here at the bottom. It's a pretty clear split. The top 5 overperformed, the bottom 5 underperformed. One interesting quirk, Dadonoff's average was 3 years as opposed to 5. He came over from the KHL, so This number's a little bit skewed just because of the sample size. And then you notice Taylor Hall way down here at the bottom, and he had a decent underperforming season in the sense that, his usual average is 9.93. He ended up with a 0.8, and he didn't end up signing a massive deal off the back of that season for that reason. But going into the free agent period, he might have been seen as one of the top guys. He just didn't, end up the top guy because of that underperformance. So, when we look at the difference between the previous season and their average, this time it was a little bit different. So the numbers favored the unders. They were at 0.112 underneath their 5-year average, while the overs were over by 0.084. So that did throw a little bit of a wrench into the contract year bump phenomenon, but all of these top guys did overproduce. So they overproduced and they got paid. But the question is, what does this mean for your fantasy team? So just looking at these 3 years of data, here's what we can surmise. So number one, the top 2 highest paid free agents, every one of those 3 seasons, overperformed their 5-year averages every time. Number 2, more often than not, the top half, or relatively the top half of these free agent earners, overproduced compared to their averages. And number 3, usually the overproducers more than doubled the underproducers, except in 2020. And as I mentioned, a lot of that was off the back of Taylor Hall, who should have been higher on that list, but just underperformed, and that brought down the averages as well. So, as I mentioned before, the causation-causality debate about this is whether or not the top-earning free agents are getting those contracts because of their overproduction in a contract year. But for us fantasy owners, this is relatively meaningless, because if the top free agents usually overperform in a contract year, and if the overperformance is more than double the underperformance for other free agents, then there isn't much risk associated with taking a player in a contract year. So if you target a player that's due to hit free agency, whether it's UFA or RFA, it likely won't hurt you, as their underperformance will be closer to their average. But if you target one of these free agents and they happen to overperform, you're more likely to reap the benefits, as an overproduction will be a bigger deviation from their average. So this could be a good strategy to apply in your draft to try to find value wherever you can. And the best place to implement this is if you're determining between 2 relatively equal players and one of them happens to be in a contract year. You should definitely go with the pending free agent, as there's a higher chance of a potential breakout season and less risk of a potentially detrimental season for that player on your fantasy team. So then that brings us to the 2023 free agent list. Who is playing for money this year? Who's in a contract year? So these are the top 25 potential free agents sorted by point per game average. So this list will give us a general sense of who might be motivated to perform during the 22-23 season. And in order to look for value, let's start by looking at the bottom of this list. So if you look at the bottom, Tim Stützle all the way down here, 0.73 points per game. His rookie year, he played 53 games, 12 goals, 17 assists, 25 points, 0.54 points per game. Year 2, 79 games, 22 goals, 36 assists, 58 points, 0.73 point per game. So a big jump from year 1 to year 2. And if you believe in, potential regression for younger players, then maybe don't look here, but everything is lining up nicely for Stützle to have a good season. So he's in a contract year, obviously. He had a healthy uptick in production between year 1 and year 2. And now he's likely going to be playing with 0.87 point per game Giroux and 0.95 point per game DeBrincat, which could also bump his 5-on-5 production. And on top of that, he's been a mainstay on their top power play unit and could keep that spot despite these additions. So he's a guy that's playing for money, although he's an RFA, so he doesn't have a ton of rights. He is playing for money, and there are some factors that line up in his favor that could potentially produce you value. If he can produce, anywhere close to a 0.9, then that would be a really good season for Stützle, and you will probably be able to get him deeper in your draft. So if you're looking anything past the 5th or 6th round and Stützle's there, and if he ends up putting up a 0.9 or above point per game average, then that could be really excellent value for your team. Along the same lines, right above him, Pierre-Luc Dubois. So he has a .64 5-year point per game average. He was above that at a .74 last year, which improved on a .45 point per game season the year before. So he's trending in the right direction. Dubois isn't just playing for a contract. He's playing to get himself out of a situation that he doesn't want to be in. So he forced his way out of Columbus, if you remember. Now he's trying to force his way out of Winnipeg, which will mean two things. One, he may potentially be traded mid-season to a contender if the Jets struggle. That could be good value for your fantasy team. Or number two, he's incredibly motivated just in general to try to get out of Winnipeg. So these are the types of things that you look for when trying to find value in your draft. So with Dubois, he's never put up a season higher than a .75 point per game average, and his highest point total was 61 points 4 years ago. So that's one of those files. If we looked at some of the other videos, you saw that regression candidate, a guy who usually puts up points in a certain range and then takes a jump one season for whatever reason. You want to look at the guys that have kind of been in that channel, been in that range, and hope that you can pick them the year that they have that breakout. And in order to increase your chances to find that breakout candidate, you look at this list and you try to pick off a guy who's playing for money and a guy who's playing and incentivized to try to get out of a situation. So this is, Dubois desperately trying to avoid those Winnipeg winters. And that might be motivation enough to help your fantasy team. Now, a little bit up on this board is Bo Horvat, and I've liked this player for a few years now. I've had him on one team basically every year for the past couple of years. He wins a lot of faceoffs if you're in a faceoff league or if your points league has faceoffs as a category. One of mine did, so he was very good for that. But on top of that, he has very consistent offensive production. So like I said before, he hovers around this .72 5-year average, and he's never dipped below .68 points per game. So there's a high floor to this file, and the ceiling may finally be reached in a contract year. That's what you're kind of looking for. High floor at .68 points per game, and he's in a contract year. In addition to the contract year bump, he slightly overpaced his average last year, but he did put up 31 goals, eclipsing the 30-goal mark for the first time in his career. And with Bruce Boudreau giving Vancouver a shot in the arm across the board last year, a full year under Bruce, potentially in a contract year and with a high floor, may make for a juicy value play in your draft. If you find Bo Horvat slipping in your draft towards the 9th, 10th, 11th round, that might be a good spot to grab him and hope for that breakout season. And he's definitely going to have some talent to work with some of those younger guys like Podkolzin. Maybe Lekara-Maki gets a look this year in Vancouver. We'll have to wait and see who Horvat ends up playing with. But that could be an interesting value play deeper in your draft. Now, next, I'm not going to go over every one of these guys. There's obviously way too many. It would take too long. But just a couple of guys I wanted to highlight. Matt Barzal. I mentioned in another video that I wouldn't go there just because he's never been an elite offensive producer. And you can see 0.81 points per game is nothing crazy. It is very good, but it's nothing crazy for a center. You can usually find that somewhere on the waiver wire. And he usually gets overdrafted because of his name value and because of the eye test. People just look at him play on the ice and they know he's a good player. But there are a few things to consider for Barzal this year. So first, he's getting out from under the Trotz defensive responsibilities that may have held back his offensive production over the last 2 seasons. Lane Lambert may be similar in style, but change is usually beneficial when a player has been feeling stifled offensively, and that can sometimes be the case here. So we don't have any reports of Barzal feeling disgruntled or like he's not being used appropriately, because nothing comes out of the New York Islanders organization with Lou Lamoriello at the helm. But, there is a sense that, he could pop off for a lot more points than that. He's just been held back by his two-way play, which is good that he's playing, defensively, and he's a responsible 200-foot player. But for your fantasy team, you want that production. Secondly, last year, he underperformed his 5-year average. So usually he's a .86. Last year, he had a .81, a little bit below his usual numbers. But that leaves a little bit of room for a bounce back type of season just built into his deviation from his average. Add to that the contract year bump and a relatively high .75 point per game floor, which he achieved 4 years ago. That makes for a compelling argument. If there was ever a year for somebody like me to grab Barzal, I suppose it would be this year. I do kind of think that there are better options out there, but if you like Barzal, this would be the year to get him, as opposed to any other year where he might have been focusing more on defense. A little bit further up the board, Rope Hintz. 72 points in 80 games means two things. He put up points and he stayed healthy last year, which eluded him the year before. So if you'll remember, in 2021, he only played 41 games, but he managed to put up 43 points despite a lingering injury. So that year, if you remember correctly, he was basically a game time decision every game, and despite that, he still put up a ton of points. So that tells me that he can produce whether he's healthy or not, which typically provides a nice floor for the fantasy file. He's averaging 0.71 points per game over the last 5 seasons, but the last 2 seasons he had a 1.04 and a 0.9 point per game average. So he's really taken off with the increase in ice time and responsibility. Add to this the fact that he's got line mates like Jason Robertson and Joe Pavelski, who he's very familiar with, and they're both very prolific offensive players, and he will likely get top line minutes and power play exposure on the top unit. On top of that, if you look at team performance in the first year after Pete DeBoer has been hired to coach the team. So if you look at Pete DeBoer's last teams that he started to coach, in the first year in Florida, he went 41, 30, and 11. They were 8th in the conference that year. Then the first year in New Jersey finished with 48 wins, 102 points, and they went all the way to the finals before losing to Los Angeles. DeBoer's first year in San Jose, 46 wins, 98 points, and another trip to the Stanley Cup Finals. And then after replacing Gerard Gallant mid-season in 1920, DeBoer finished the year with a 14-5-4 record and led the Golden Knights to the conference finals. So all of that, the Pete DeBoer bump, the contract year bump, that might be the icing on the cake for this fantasy file. So if you're thinking about it, definitely go out and try to grab Rope Hintz, especially if he is dual position eligible. That may change because I've heard that they're a little bit more strict with that this year in Yahoo, but we'll have to wait and see depending on what league you're in. Another guy I wanted to talk about because I haven't yet, Tyler Bertuzzi, the only unvaccinated player in the NHL last year. He only played 68 games, mainly because he was not allowed into Canada. So if you look at his numbers, very good numbers, 62 points, 68 games, 30 goals, 32 assists. That's very good production, very balanced, and he's a relatively high goal-scoring winger. So that's a little bit more valuable as well, especially if he can get you dual position eligibility. If you look at, he had a 0.91 point per game average last year, and he's been trending higher every year over the last 4. So he had a 0.64, 0.67, 0.77, and a 0.91. So that's really good trend over the last 4 years. And on top of that, he's a pending UFA, and it remains to be seen if he'll factor into Steve Yzerman's plans for this new look Red Wings team. If he isn't going to be locked up, expect Bertuzzi to be traded at the deadline, as Detroit will probably be on the outside looking in and in need of some draft capital for the stacked 2023 draft. Now, as for his running mate, Dylan Larkin, who's a little bit further up on this list at a 0.97 point per game average, I'd expect him to get re-signed and be back with the Wings for a long haul. But he has been a productive center. So he has a 0.79 5-year average point per game, 0.97 last year, so he could be due for a slight regression, but his point per game numbers usually mirror the competitiveness of the Red Wings. So if you look back over the past 5 years, 0.76, 0.96, 0.74, 0.52, and then back up to 0.97. So he was trending up, then the Wings became completely non-competitive during their rebuild, and he went downward for a couple of years, but he's since bounced back to his previous ceiling. Not sure how much value there is in Larkin, depending on where he's drafted, but he's a great player on a bad team, and if you're looking for that recipe, he could be a nice deeper play in your draft. And speaking of that recipe, getting a great player on a bad team, further up this list, Timo Meier, right under a point per game average, 76 and 77, 35 goals, so a goal-heavy, dual position eligible winger. That's very valuable. He is another player on a bad team who will likely see 19 minutes or more per game, all of the top offensive situational looks, and the top power play time as well. I don't have anything great to say about the Sharks this year, but that may make him a decent value play because he might fall in your draft because of that, as he did last year. If you remember, I did the mock draft analysis video from the owner's box, cherry picking drafts from last year, and one of them picked Timo Meier with their absolute last pick, and it provided a tremendous amount of value in that range. So, if he falls, if he's there late, definitely take a look at him. And as we get towards the top of this list, the risk factor for a regression season increases because guys like McKinnon, guys like Tarasenko, they produced extremely well last year, and there's not necessarily much room for them to improve on those numbers. Some of these guys, might be able to maintain those numbers. Pastrnak may be able to exceed that number, but these top 4 guys, they're pretty close to their 5-year averages. Some of them are close to their all-time highs, like JT Miller, who put up a career season last year. But I did want to briefly mention Patrick Kane. A lot of talk about him in the offseason getting traded and whatnot. He's 34 years old. He's a pending UFA, but he just simply does not slow down. So if you look at his last 5 years, 1.16 point per game average. The goal numbers have kind of dried up as many of the key pieces have been shipped off or traded away, but he continues to produce points regardless. So if he stays in Chicago for the whole season, there is risk for a slight regression just based on the lack of available talent to work with and the fact that his goal numbers will still probably diminish. But I would bank on him getting traded at some point during the season, and you may be able to snipe some value out of his file before his name is all over the hockey news, as he's likely to garner quite a bit of attention if he is a trade target. Kane is usually a no-brainer first-round pick, and if he drops below the first round, he instantly becomes value because of his point-per-game numbers. He isn't a goal-heavy winger as of now, but a trade to a new team may unlock some goal-scoring potential at the perfect time for your fantasy team. So when you're entering your playoffs, if he gets traded to a team that has somebody that could set him up, for example, if he ends up on the Rangers and he's playing with Panarin, he put up some of his best goal numbers with Panarin, so that could potentially bump his goal numbers and his overall production right at the perfect time for your fantasy team. If he doesn't work out for your team, if he does regress quite a bit, just given the shaky nature of everything going on in Chicago, you could potentially keep him on your roster until the deadline and unload him for someone more productive, again, if he regresses to a significant amount. But you can find this list. This is information from sporttrack.com. You can find this list pretty much anywhere if you just Google 2023 potential free agents. But what we've discovered today is that there is a slight correlation between the top end players, the guys who typically get paid the most in free agency. They get paid because they put up career years during a contract year. So with all 3 of the seasons that we looked at, the top players in the free agent period overperformed their 5-year average. And then if you're looking at it on balance, like we mentioned in the previous slide, the risk is lower for trying to pick one of these players, typically speaking, because their underperformance numbers are going to be smaller than their potential overperformance numbers on average. So that 2020 season, that didn't hold up, but the other 2 seasons it held up, and it was more than double the amount that the overproducers overproduced their average compared to the underproducers. So the risk is minimal for picking one of these guys, depending on where they are in the draft, and I want you to keep that in mind. It doesn't matter who you get, it matters where you get them. So if you took Timo Meier in the first round, that's a terrible pick just because of the risk that's baked in there. But if you took him in the 10th round, that's really great value. So that's one of the big overarching themes that I wanted to make sure that I ingrain in your heads as you watch these videos, is that you want to look for value. You don't necessarily want to look at the name, but the name has value as well. So with a guy like Kane, if he is going to be moved, you could use his name value even if he's not putting up the numbers and try to get a really good, productive player for your team that way. It just depends on what you're trying to do with your strategy. But that'll do it for this video, and I want to thank you again for watching and paying attention. If you have any potential questions that you want me to answer, just leave a comment beneath this video, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Like and subscribe this video if you liked it and you want some more content like this. But I want to thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.